Did I ever tell you the time I went to the zoo? And I was walking around, looking at the different cages. I see this one cage and I look inside. I see nothing, no animal or nothing. There's just this French baguette in the middle of the cage. That's very strange. Is it a food for the animal or something? I don't know. No, I see this zookeeper walking, so I go and say, "Excuse me, what's in this cage here? What's supposed to be in here? I just see a French baguette." The zookeeper, he say to me, "Ah, that's bred in captivity."
Hey everybody, this is Peter Skov for Music as a Journey, and today I am doing the next part of my three-part series on Canadian hard rock and heavy metal. In the first part, we talked about bands from the 1970s and how with the invention of the Juno Awards and CanCon, Canadian content, both those things, CanCon gave Canadian bands more opportunity to be exposed on the radio at home, because previously in the 1960s they were basically shrugged off in favor of British or American artists. But from the 1970s they had to have 25% Canadian content on radio and television, and so that gave bands a big chance to get more exposure at home. And then of course with the Juno Awards they could be recognized for their efforts. So now we're going to move on to the 1980s. And the 1980s is a really important time, not only for the Canadian hard rock and heavy metal scene, but just for heavy metal music in general, because the way I see it was the 1980s was when heavy metal really came into its own, and when the heavy metal tree just started branching out in so many different directions. So I want to tell you about some of the bands that were coming out of Canada at the time. I have a fairly good bunch of them. So we're just going to go through these stacks. They're not in any particular order exactly, just probably the more hard rock or traditional metal types are at the front, and then those that start heading off into, thrash metal, speed metal, and so on are coming up a bit later on. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, one of the most important hard rock bands to come out of Canada in the 1970s was, of course, Triumph. You thought I was going to say Rush, didn't you? Of course. Well, anyway, but as we know, in the 1980s, Rush kind of scaled back from their hard side and started exploring new territories, which is fine, good for them. But it does mean that, previously I said I wasn't going to talk about them because everybody knows about Rush. Now, there's just almost not much point, because in the 1980s, they didn't really do much that was really in the hard rock or heavy metal territory, except around the beginning. So, Triumph is the band I'm going for. And they had 3 albums in the 70s, and then from 1980, Allied Forces, and then Never Surrender, and holy smokes, where's Progressions of Power? There is also Progressions of Power, which actually I think is the 1980 album. That's funny that it's not here. I must have hidden it somewhere, because I do have it. I have almost all of Triumph's albums. Anyway, and this of course brings us up then to Thunder 7, which was the album that really kind of kicked off their career in a large-scale stage. They'd had a lot of hits before, but this was the album that really made them kind of stand out, and it's the album that made me first really understand who they were. And I remember with the opening track, there was a review in, I think it was Circus Magazine, and the reviewer wrote that Rick Emmett's guitar sounds like a rusty chainsaw or something, which I thought was pretty cool. The interesting thing about Triumph is, while they were always a pretty solid hard rock band, they could often go into kind of progressive territory with these longer songs, or songs in 2 parts, sometimes having more slower parts with Rick Emmett's classical guitar, and then, longer sections, instrumental passages, and sometimes also getting pretty heavy as well. So Triumph were actually my favorite Canadian band at one point there during my high school years in the latter half of the 1980s. I don't have the album after that, Sport of Kings. It just got really light and radio friendly, and I've never felt inclined to buy it on CD. But the one that came after that, Surveillance, this was a kind of return to form. Yeah, there's still some more radio friendly tunes on here, but the guitars really rock out. And one interesting thing was Steve Morse. actually, I think he had stopped playing in bands at the time and decided to become a pilot. And then he decided to fly up and pay Rick Emmett a visit. And then Rick Emmett invited him to join in on some of the Triumph recording sessions. So Steve Morse actually contributes guitar to 2 tracks on this album. And of course, after this album, Rick Emmett left Triumph and they did one more album with another person, and then that was kind of it for the band. And I don't know, they've had some reunions or something maybe, but anyway, from the latter half of the 70s through most of the albums in the 80s, Triumph were a really solid hard rocking band, sometimes progressive, sometimes heavy, so they were interesting like that. Three band members and 2 singers, pretty cool. Okay. There was, you know, Jeff Barton, maybe, a music journalist who wrote for Kerrang! Magazine and also was writing for some other, maybe Melody Maker previously. He's the one who's known for coining the phrase, the new wave of British heavy metal. He also coined a phrase, Maple Mayhem. Because in the early 80s, there were a lot of Canadian bands who were looking to get known outside of Canada, and a lot of them were kind of struggling in the US because the US wasn't so much interested in Canadian bands a lot, like some places were, but not a lot. So they thought, well, let's try to hit the European market. And as it turned out, in a lot of European countries, heavy metal was really looked down upon as, you know, youth corrupting type music, and a lot of radio stations were actually not permitted to play heavy metal bands in some countries, I read anyway. But their own homegrown bands were discouraged, but then all these Canadian artists started showing up, and it was really exciting because here was a country where there was this kind of boom going on in hard rock and heavy metal music. So there's something I read about that. And anyway, of course, not to say the UK had this problem, obviously not, but Jeff Barton, anyway, then with all these Canadian bands that were showing up in Europe, albums showing up in Europe, he came up with the phrase Maple Mayhem. And that, I think, is actually explained in here. Now, this is a band called Coney Hatch. This is their debut album, and this is the Rock Candy reissue. I'm going to tell you about Rock Candy in another video because I do have issues with some of their reissues, but this one here is very good. One of the things I like is that their reissues come with these bonus tracks and then this 3,000 word essay about the history of the band or something, so that's really useful. So anyway, Coney Hatch, their first album, really a good solid hard rocking album, 4-piece band, 2 vocalists, really cool. Toured with Iron Maiden, and I think Judas Priest toured the Defenders of the Faith tour with Great White because I saw them in concert in Vancouver, but later on Great White were knocked off the tour for some reason, and then Coney Hatch came along. Maybe I should have seen them, I don't know, but Great White were good. Okay, so yeah, and then the second album, this one here, also a reissue on Rock Candy. The first track, total kick-ass, and after that I really don't know because the rest of the album just gets really loud and scratchy. The remastering job was really done very poorly on this one, and I'm so disappointed, and there aren't any other copies of CD available, so anyway, but we're going to talk about that in another video sometime. So that's Coney Hatch. They actually did have one other album, but by that time, the kind of more pop hard rock sound with the keyboards and the big hair and so on, and the, I don't know, whatever, started becoming popular. So that was their third album, which I haven't felt inclined to get anyway. But yeah, first album for sure, solid, good, excellent, great album. This one probably is. It just needs to be remastered properly. Okay, a band, I'm just going to kind of lightly mention them because they showed up here in the stack. This is a band called Harlequin out of Winnipeg, I think. Kind of hard rock, or I don't know what you call it, like Loverboy, that kind of hard rocking guitar, but also keyboards and catchy melodies and catchy vocal choruses and so on. So the songs I wouldn't really say are exactly hard rock, but they do have that hard rock guitar and the kind of beat and the sound. It's just with the additional keyboards really being featured, it does lighten it up a bit and make it a bit more of a kind of, you know, radio rock type band. But anyway, Harlequin. This is their second album, I think, Love Crimes. they had a song in here called Innocence. If you listen to Harlequin's song Innocence on YouTube, you'll understand what I mean by, anyway, that kind of more brighter sound. So we're going to move along. We're going to check out the first album by Headpins, Turn It Loud. This is a band out of Vancouver, started by Brian Too Loud McLeod, who was playing in Chilliwack as well. Started a band called Headpins. They had a female vocalist who was pretty strong, but she left, and then they were looking to get someone else in, and they got a woman named Darby Mills. Absolutely awesome female hard rock vocalist. I mean, just one of those raw whiskey throat voices and can totally belt out the notes. The big hit off here was Don't It Make You Feel? Kind of a more, not so punchy, but still kind of groovy, heavy song. But the opening track, Turn It Loud, that's really the ball breaker on this one here. Pretty cool. So after that, I think also Headpins had 2 or 3 other albums before Darby Mills left, and then they got another 1 or 2 singers in, and Brian McLeod passed away of cancer actually in the early 90s, I think it was. So, but during the time with Darby Mills, they also started moving towards that more, big hair, bright keyboard sound. So going more for the video hits rather than the hard rockin' sound. At least on the album. I don't know, live they might have been better. Of course, one of the big Canadian longtime bands now is Helix. 2 albums in the late 70s, and then this one here, No Rest for the Wicked, was their first album after they moved to a major label. I forget what it is now, but this is a Rock Candy reissue, this one here. And again, this is one where I think the person in charge of the mastering was just falling asleep and pushing the dial up. So it starts off okay, and then it just gets really scratchy. So even during the ballad, when vocalist Brian Vollmer is singing on his own, you hear this scratchy echo sound in his voice. It's terrible. But again, we're going to talk about that in another episode. Brian Vollmer, I actually met him once. He came to our local record store to promote their album Wild in the Streets, so I had a chance to meet him and talk to him just a little bit and have a picture of him. I think he was holding my sister actually at the time. Anyway, really swell guy, I really liked him. I liked Helix a lot. Actually, I liked this one here, Walking the Razor's Edge, better. This had that famous rock you, give me an R, R, O, C, K, and some other great tracks on here. Also, the cover Make Me Do Anything You Want by the band A Foot in Cold Water. We talked about them in the previous video about 70s Canadian hard rock bands. And after this, they did Long Way to Heaven, I think it was called, and then Wild in the Streets. Both albums I had. Good, but I consider them more a kind of like hard rock, good time hard rock band. Like, just fun stuff you might want to play at a party or while you're, cruising down the highway or something. But this album is still maybe my favorite of theirs, Walking the Razor's Edge from 1984, I think it is. Okay, another awesome band. I think they were actually out of Saskatchewan, Kick-Axe. They have an American vocalist. What's his name? Kristen. Anyway, great band. They did 3 albums in the 80s. This one here, the debut, Vices, actually had a good video for this. Heavy Metal Shuffle, the song. Really cool, fun band. The next album got a little bit more diverse. Welcome to the Club. I actually still quite liked it though, and I have both of them, this one and the other one. Okay, it looks like the cat needs to go out, so it's time for me to pause the video anyway, and then we'll move on. Yes, Kurama, you have to come in and disturb the video. You gotta say hi to the camera. Okay, I'm sure the cat will want to come in again in about 3 minutes. Anyway, one interesting band is this one here called Killer Dwarfs. This is their debut album. This is actually really a cool album. I forgot how good it was. Maybe I'll show you a close-up picture of this one here with the band on the back. They are just a really fun and crazy band. But this album also has some really good, solid, hard-rocking tunes. One of them, Heavy Metal Breakdown, a great song. In some ways, they almost remind me of a slightly more metal version of Young Rush sometimes. Pretty cool. The next album after this, Stand Tall, I think it was released on Sony, and it has never been reissued on CD, I think, or just like way back when. So I can't get it, but they had one really great song on there, very fun video. And the third album was this one here, Big Deal. Yeah. This one is, for my taste, it's getting to be a little bit too generic in a way. It doesn't have that kind of special standout quality that the debut album, sorry, I'm putting my finger over someone's face here, has. But I remember reading in the beginning when these guys started, I think everyone in the band was supposed to be under 5 feet tall or something like that. Anyway, this debut album, I really like it. Okay, this band here is quite an interesting thing. This is Piledriver. This is the second album, Stay Ugly. There was another one before this called Metal Inquisition. The very interesting thing about this is that Piledriver was, at the time, never a band. It turned out like some musicians were asked to record some material to make a kind of, generic metal album, because it was the time where everybody wanted to hear more metal. Well, not everybody, of course, but metalheads wanted to get more metal. Everybody wanted to find new bands and so on. And so there were some companies that were just like tossing out albums that, thrown together by musicians who needed extra money or who owed money or something. And I think as the story goes, David DeFay of Virgin Steel was asked to write music and lyrics and so on for 3 albums to pay off some debts he owed his manager or something like that. And I've read 2 versions, one where he completely denies this and another one where he actually is interviewed and actually speaks about the 3 albums he made. Now the dude singing on here, oh gosh, I've forgotten his name, so I'm going to have to put it at the bottom here. Oh, he just goes by Piledriver on here, but he does have a name. And the guy who actually does the vocals on this does the vocals on both albums. Apparently he was paid $250 for both recording sessions. Never thought anything more of it until he finally hooked up to the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s. Suddenly found out that Piledriver albums actually had this big underground following and were really popular. So he decided to start up the band on his own. However, turns out there were at least 3 other bands named Piledriver by this time. Including one from the Philippines, I think. So, yeah, he has a new name for them, Piledriver. I'll put it at the bottom of the screen here. Okay. But, yeah, anyway, very interesting story. How is the music? Well, it's a little bit like, typical heavy metal music of the 80s. A little bit on the kind of metal, what did my friend call it? The metal meathead music side. But it's fun. It's all right. I had to get it anyway, just because the story was so interesting. Okay, I have here a box set of 4 albums by a band called Santers. I actually remember reading about them. They are, I'm going to say, they are a kind of Mr. Nice Guy hard rock band. As the first album especially probably rocks out, I don't know, maybe the first 3 albums all kind of rock out fairly well, but they're quite nice in a way. Like there's no really dirty raunchy lyrics, there's no lyrics about like war and gore or anything like this. It's just like a nice type rock band that just rocks out a little bit harder. I was interested in getting a hold of their albums, at least 1 or 2 of them, and then I came across this box set. There was a 4th album which was for a while unreleased, but anyway, I have all of them here now. I can't say I listened to it a lot, but nevertheless, Santers were one of those bands from the early 80s in Canada, like Coney Hatch and some of the other ones, who were on the hard rock side, and then later on started to soften up a bit with more keyboards. But I think they kind of left out the keyboards until this 4th unreleased album. Well, released later on eventually. Anyway, that's Santers. Of one of Canada's best female vocalists, Aeran, I only have this compilation album now. I used to have 2 or 3 of her albums on cassette. Well, what can I say? I mean, she was kind of Canada's heavy metal queen in the 1980s. And her song, Metal Queen, you actually find that around 83, 84, 85, 86, a lot of Canadian bands were using metal in their song titles. And so this one was Metal Queen, really interesting 80s type metal video, woman in, kind of skimpy clothing with a big sword and chains and boa constrictors. But she had a lot of other hits, and some of the ones from later on What You Do to My Body, and Hands On. They are really fun hard rock tunes, and the videos were fun too, like lots of, paint splashing around and whatever. Anyway, Aeran. She later on went into singing jazz. She was from Toronto. She moved to Vancouver and started singing jazz, I remember. But more recently, she's gone back to doing the kind of hard rock style. So that's pretty cool. That's Aeran. But anyway, here's a band called White Wolf. I wasn't so much into them at the time. However, when I started getting into Canadian metal a couple of years ago, wanting to check out stuff from the 80s, I picked them up. It's not bad. It's again mid-80s metal. There's some keyboards. There's a lot of melody and stuff. I think they have a song on here. They have a song on here called Metal Thunder. Yeah. So yeah, it's your mid-80s heavy hard guitar sound, some melody, some keyboards and that. So by today's standards, it's not really all that heavy, but at the time it was metal, and they had, I think, 1 or 2 other albums after this. So that's White Wolf. Never got them on cassette in the 80s, but did pick up the CD, and yeah, it's all right. The Eternal Masterworks, whatever, who cares? Anyway, White Wolf. We talked about Thor, the 1970s, and he continued on finding more success in the 1980s, moving to the UK, releasing a couple of albums. This is Only the Strong. I wanted to get it because I kind of became interested in this guy, bodybuilder and heavy metal vocalist. And I got this lovely, there's the picture from the 1970s with the dogs. It is a CD of Only the Strong and a DVD and a really nice package, except that the recording quality of the original CD on here is not good. It's again really scratchy. So I'm going to have to talk about this in another video. But it's lots of bonus tracks anyway. I haven't watched the DVD yet, but I don't know. Nice package. I just really hate it when remastered albums don't sound good. Alright, I'm going to mention just a few more bands here. This is Sword. Now these guys are really solid, traditional metal band. Probably a little bit closer to the metal church side. Like really solid, heavy riffs, powerful vocals. This album, Metalized, had a song, Stuck in Rock. But the whole album is just one really solid, hard-hitting piece, which is why I had to get it on CD. Used to have it on cassette in the 80s. Sword, Metalized. Great 80s heavy metal album. Like heavy metal album. Cool stuff. Okay, the next 3, we're actually getting into the early 90s, but I'm going to mention them because from the 90s onwards, I want to talk about basically the heavier bands, alright? But this was a hair band that formed in the late 80s and came out, had 1 or 2 albums. This is Slick Toxic, Doing the Nasty. Basically what you would expect from the second type of hair metal, which is the more Guns N' Roses, Dangerous Toys type of hair metal. Not big poofy hair and makeup, but instead straight, greasy leather, that kind of thing. So this is Slick Toxic, Doing the Nasty. Pretty cool thing here, pretty cool album. And a similar band is one called Svengali, which is again a really hard-hitting, heavy hair metal band, not the Poison type, the more Guns N' Roses, the kind of heavier hair metal type. Both bands coming out the late 80s, 1 or 2 albums, and then of course the whole grunge scene came and hair metal was out and they, I don't know, had to go find something else to do. But I think at least Svengali is reformed and still touring these days. That's kind of cool. Alright, and then one other band. This is a band called Harum-Scarum. Now their style is, I don't know what you'd call it. It's hard rock, but really good lead guitar playing. It's a little bit on the technical side. Brilliant lead guitar playing. And just these loud dual vocal or triple vocal even harmonic choruses. Like Justice in the World, like this kind of thing. Maybe not what I would normally be into, but they just do it. On this one here, Mood Swings, they just do it so well. So, yeah, I have to mention this one here. If you're into that kind of thing, it's cool. Very nicely done. I haven't heard what some of their other albums are like, and later on they changed their name, I think, to Rubber something. I don't know, I forget. And then back to Harum-Scarum. But the first one here, Mood Swings, I can tell you, if you're into that kind of thing, it's worth checking out. Okay, we've knocked off a pretty good stack of albums there by Canadian bands during the 1980s, most of which were basically going for the more hard rock sound, a little bit more melody, later on evolving into a little bit more mainstream sound with lots of nice melodies and some keyboards and so on, that more polished look. Anyway, before we go on to the last bit here, I think this is a good time to point out this book, which has been sitting here quietly in the background all this time, Metal on Ice, Tales from Canada's Hard Rock and Heavy Metal Heroes by Sean Kelly. Now, if you don't know who Sean Kelly is, well, he's a guitarist, and last I heard he was playing for Helix. I believe I wrote about this book on the Music is a Journey blog. I did. I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago, and at the time I actually shared the blog post with Sean Kelly and got a little bit of dialogue with him, which is cool. At that time anyway, he was still playing guitar for Helix. So anyway, what he did was to write a book about Canada's metal scene in the 1980s, and he covered a good bunch of bands. And it is actually thanks to this book that I found out about Slick Toxic and Svengali. There were other bands that he also included, like Honeymoon Suite or Haywire, and I don't know so much about Haywire. Their first album, I believe, was a little bit more of the radio-friendly mainstream type, but apparently their second album was more of a bonkers hard rock type album. But yeah, it covers that other more lighter side. Also a band called Toronto, which I only know the one song, which I didn't think was all that hard rock. But anyway, we're on that kind of hard rock light side and then going up into metal as well. A lot of the bands that he didn't have a chance to interview, like Triumph, and I think a lot of the thrasher bands and so on, weren't really covered in the book. But it is a very good book if you're interested in reading about the Canadian heavy metal scene in the 1980s. Talking about the hardships of bands, how they got started playing in local clubs and gradually expanding until finally they started going outside of their hometowns. In most cases, we were looking at the Toronto scene. The hardships of being a Canadian band on a cross-country tour, because Canada only has like some major city centers very far apart. It's not quite like the US, which is more like a checkerboard in a way. In Canada, it's like you go from this city and drive a few hours to this city and then drive a day or more to the next city and so on. Like once you get away from the kind of Montreal and the Great Lakes area, it's a long drive from place to place. And then when you go from Calgary to Vancouver, it's about like a 12-hour drive. You got to go through the Rockies. You do this in winter time. You're going down slope on icy roads in the winter. Some pretty harrowing tales. And one interesting point that comes up near the end is, what is one kind of unifying aspect, something that unifies all Canadian bands that makes them different from American or European bands? And the one thing they say is the hockey arenas. When those band members were kids, they would go to the hockey arenas to watch hockey games. Then as teenagers, they would go and watch their favorite bands perform. And then as adults, they would be on stage performing. And they said there was something about that, going to the place where you went as a kid to watch hockey and the kind of smell of the hockey arena, sweaty gloves or whatever, and then going there again to watch your bands and going back as an adult later on performing. There's something about that that is maybe kind of unique for Canadian bands. Of course, American bands probably also perform in hockey arenas, but in the 1980s, that was a kind of key point. Anyway, without dragging on too much longer, that is a very interesting book if you can get a hold of it, and if you're interested in the topic, that's where I got to know a lot of the bands here, or got to know about a lot of their information. Now then, the final part of this video, which, yeah, is going to be about the heavier metal scene. I did mention Sword in here. Sword actually could have been in this part, but they kind of randomly popped up. So, we're going to move on to one of the most well-known Canadian heavy metal bands, Anvil. This is their second album, Metal on Metal, and their third album, Forged in Fire. I don't have any others. I should. I like both of these. I'm thinking I will get more Anvil albums. And, you know, there was that documentary about them where they kind of came across as kind of like, you know, the guy next door type of people, really cool guys and so on. So, yeah, this one here, of course, the classic song Metal on Metal. What a killer riff. And Forged in Fire, the lead track off here, is also really awesome. Both albums good, but I mean great, great albums. But the important thing for Anvil is that they are one of the bands that took the kind of more speedy, aggressive sound that was coming out with a lot of new wave of British heavy metal bands, just upped it up a little bit more, which was kind of like the missing link between new wave of British heavy metal and thrash metal, some people say. A lot of thrash metal bands were exactly influenced by Anvil. And along with Anvil, this band here, Exciter. This is their, I think it's their first album, Heavy Metal Maniac. 1982, if I recall, either recorded in 82 and released in early 83, or it is actually from 82. Quite a speedy, almost like proto-thrash type album. You can see that thrash metal is just the kind of obvious next step from here. And this is their fourth album, Long Live the Loud, which is quite a well-known album. Again, I'm not totally satisfied with the remastered versions. There's something amiss, but nevertheless important albums in not only Canadian heavy metal, but in heavy metal history. That period in the 80s where metal just started branching out all over the place. Okay, Exciter and Anvil. Now, another awesome band is Razor, Canadian thrash band. This, I believe, is the second album, Evil Invaders. Song of the Executioner, Evil Invaders, Malicious Intent, and then Violent Restitution. I think those are the first four albums. I had this on cassette along with Malicious Intent. Had to get it on CD. Really heavy thrash. And vocalist on here, I forget his name now. I think his nickname is Sheepdog. He has got a killer voice. I mean, it's tough and gruff, but he's got one of those like banshee type screams that has this like upper wail to the kind of raw throat, and he can really hold it. You should hear the opening track on here, The Martial Arts. I'm not sure if it's double track, like once and then repeated or not, but it is a freaking long scream. Okay, killer album. This was actually mentioned on Kerrang's list of 15 Canadian metal albums you should own, but it also said the next two albums after this were even more furious. But that vocalist, this was his last album with the band. Anyway, I have these two. I enjoy them very much. One of the songs here, Taste the Floor, actually has a chainsaw in it, which is pretty cool. Sounds awesome. Okay, and then band that didn't really get very far, but now is given quite a fair bit of high regard, is Slaughter. There was an American hair metal band also called Slaughter. This is a kind of early... It's the kind of transition period from thrash, really raw, guttural thrash, into death metal. I mean, it's a death metal cover on here, for heaven's sake. This skeleton in the Strapato. It's called Strapato. And also Chuck Schuldiner of Death actually played with this band for about 6 months. This album, I think, is from 1986. So a very important album in the kind of early death metal scene as well. Slaughter. Pretty cool. Okay, we often talk about the big four in thrash out of the US, and also Germany's big four. Canada has a big four as well, including Razor, Voivod, Annihilator, who are coming up, and Sacrifice. This is Sacrifice's second album, Forward to Termination. Their first one is not really a thrash album. It's a little bit closer to the black metal side a bit. They start going more thrash here. And then they had two more albums, one in 1990, one in 1992. Both terrific albums. I think I will probably bring them up in the next episode where it's from the 90s onward. But this one here is probably one of the more higher regarded albums. I actually like the next one afterwards a little bit better. There was a reissue series done with the original album plus loads of live performances as well as some demos and so on here. So that's what I got, double disc. Sacrifice, okay? You cannot talk about Canadian heavy metal without talking about these guys, Voivod. This is the debut album, War and Pain. I had it on cassette. It was on the Banzai label during the 1980s, and they had this little like wheel of spinning axes, which was put on speed metal albums, and that was put on this one here. I think Destruction also was on that label with a speed metal logo on there. Anyway, one thing that I really liked about Voivod, after hearing bands like Exodus and Metallica and so on, Voivod were just so different. They weren't totally thrash all the time. They had this also more lumbering side with the heavy bass coming in, and the image was almost like the American thrash bands. They were like souped up racing cars, which were just primed for speed. And then Voivod came along with this massively clunking machine that was held together with string, gum, and duct tape and so on, but just let out this massive roar to it. And in fact, their second album was actually called Roar! Triple R, Triple O, Triple A, Triple R. Which I don't have, but that was exactly a really speedy album. But, of course, Voivod are more well known for the albums that came after. Killing Technology, probably my favorite Voivod album. This is where the transition starts to come in, where the thrash element or speed metal element is combined with their kind of hardcore punk sound, and then starts to break into this science fiction progressive metal style that only Voivod have been able to do in that way. And I think it's because they're from a small town in Quebec, and you see in the 1970s progressive rock was really popular in Quebec, and then late 70s, early 80s they had this really strong punk scene in Quebec, and then of course by the 80s the metal scene started catching on there. So I'm sure it was exactly that progressive rock and that punk and the metal scene that just made Voivod the perfect place to develop a brand new style. Dimension Hatros, the fourth album, and of course Nothing Face, one of the most classic Canadian heavy metal and progressive metal albums of all time. These three are just an incredible trilogy to have. Wonderful, terrific, amazing albums. Love them. Oh no, we're down to the last two. Okay, this band I actually just stumbled across watching a compilation of a compilation video of thrash bands where they just introduced like 10-15 seconds of music from each band. And this is a band called Aggression, and that video just very nicely put in labels for where those bands were from, and Aggression from Canada, apparently from Quebec. And this is just really blistering, off the rails thrash metal with, I swear it almost sounds like blast beats in a couple of the tracks on here. It's just really raw, aggressive stuff. The name perfectly suits it. And I think they only had this one album and maybe an EP and disappeared for a while, but they came back with an album. I don't know if it was in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And as far as I know, they have a website and they're still active again. So this is Aggression. What's this called here? The Full Treatment. If you have a chance to hear this, you should check it out. Pretty amazing stuff. If you like this really like wild, crazy, exploding off the rails thrash metal. Okay, and of course Annihilator. This is a compilation. This is an album with Alice in Hell and Never Neverland. The first two Annihilator albums. Actually got started in Toronto. Guitarist Jeff Waters somewhere around the mid-80s. But it wasn't until, let's see, late 80s they moved to Vancouver, and then finally 89, the first album came out, and 99, the second one. And Annihilator are one of the big four of Canadian thrash, along with Sacrifice, Razor, and Voivod, one of the most well-known extreme metal bands out of Canada, as far as I know. Long history, of course, going back to the 80s. Okay, so, and that is what I have for Canadian hard rock and heavy metal in the 1980s. Once again, take a look at this book. I do have a video that I made with samples of heavy music out of Canada in the 80s. I'm going to put a link there, so you can click on that and watch it after. And in the third installment of this Canadian hard rock and heavy metal series, we're going to take a look at the mostly more extreme metal to come out of Canada in the 90s and then going up to the present. And then after that, at the end of that, I'm going to introduce a little project of mine, which I've already begun, but I'll tell you about that as we come to the end of the third video. So that is enough for today. Man, I talk a lot. Okay, thanks for watching, and I hopefully will have you watching again in the third installment of this Canadian heavy metal series. All right, catch you next time then. Bye.